to season 4 of Digit Debates. We're really delighted to have Abi here today, and Astrid will introduce her. But just to introduce the season this term, we're going to have topics around inclusiveness, connectivity and social protection. So we hope you'll be able to join us for more of the research-informed thought pieces over the term. And if you want to catch up, they're on Catch Up on Demand as well. So over to Astrid to chair the meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gemma and Jackie. Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's Digit Debate seminar. My name is Astrid Krenz, and I am a research fellow at the Digital Futures at Work Research Center at the University of Sussex. We are very happy to welcome Abi Adams-Prassl to our seminar. Abi is an associate professor in economics at the University of Oxford, and her research covers a wide range of topics in applied microeconomics, family decision-making, labor economics, gender inequalities, and using large-scale data sets. She has published extensively in leading journals in economics, law, and computer science. And Abi is the co-founder of the COVID Inequality Project and a specialist advisor to the UK Parliament Women and Equalities Select Committee on the economic impact of the pandemic. And she was recently elected to the Governing Council of the Royal Economic Society. Today, she's going to speak about the gender wage gap in an online labor market, the cost of interruptions. So Abi, we are very happy to have you here and looking forward to your presentation. So I hand over to you.
Oh, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I am just going to start sharing my screen. Can I just check, Astrid, is this sharing correctly before I get going? Fabulous. Okay, well, yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and the possibility to speak to you all today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards. So this paper, just to give a bit of background where this paper started. So back in 2015, I was talking to some friends who work at the International Labour Organization, who had at that point started running a bunch of surveys about workers in online labour markets. And one of the things that they were finding in this survey, or well, which I found at least in this survey when I was kind of truffling through it, was even on these online labour markets where workers aren't necessarily even their gender is not even identifiable to the employers who were hiring them online. We found this 20% gender pay gap in this survey evidence. And this just seemed really, really puzzling to me, because a lot of the reasons that we think of why we might see gender disparities in the workplace just didn't really seem to they didn't seem to be as operative, or they should be as salient in some of these kind of online digital labour markets. So this paper is really the kind of jumped off from that point, because given in the survey data that we didn't have sufficient information to really understand what was actually behind this 20% difference. Was it that men and women were doing different types of tasks online? Was it that, or was it coming through something else? And so in this paper, this is the kind of attempt to make some progress on answering that question. Now, I think there are two big literatures, there are two literatures that I kind of think about this paper as relating to. The first, as Astrid said, I'm an economist, and we have like a kind of very active literature within economics about trying to understand gender disparities in the labour market. And what we see is this emerging empirical literature that is documenting persistent differences in pay and in working patterns, even in so-called gender-blind workplaces. So, for example, on Uber, where the amount that you get paid is determined, by an algorithm, you see a 4 to 6% difference in hourly earnings between men and women, which is largely being driven by women. Not being as responsive to surge pricing, so they're less likely to drive at particular types of day or in particular areas which Uber gives a bonus to. And women also drive slower. And then we also have another nice paper in this literature, Bolotny and Emmanuel, which is coming out in the Journal of Labour Economics. They're looking at a heavily unionized labour market setting in the US, the Boston bus and tram setting, and what they're finding is, again, even in this situation where the option sets that men and women are given are completely equal in terms of the pay schedules and in terms of the shifts, women earn 11% less than men on average, and that's basically comes down to women being less likely to take up certain kind of more highly paid overtime that is kind of offered at short notice. So what we kind of see is this, even in these scenarios where on the face of it, it looks like men and women are being given access to equal pay structures and equal, if you like, kind of opportunities, you still see these persistences in earnings differences. And it kind of seems natural then to kind of think about, well, perhaps part of this is still coming through down, of course, to inequalities in household care, and the way that and the interaction between unpaid and paid work that that we have. And could these gender differences in the labour market, even in these gender blind settings, really be due to gender differences and constraints in the ability to work outside the home? So a natural kind of next starting point, at least where I thought of when I was coming at this literature, was like, well, will innovations that make it easier to work from home facilitate a further convergence in outcomes for men and women in the labour market? Because then some of these constraints about when and where you're able to engage in paid work, which do seem to differentially affect men and women, those might be less salient in a working from home setting. Now, I started this project before COVID, and so I think, I think the bullet point 2 obviously now seems incredibly naive, that actually this idea that suddenly, because you're working from home, inequalities in how domestic care and childcare are set up within the home might not affect paid work as much, is obviously like not a particularly good starting point. But nonetheless, working from home, it does seem when you're looking at when we look at these arguments about about when we think about the future of the labour market, and we think about the role from working from home that might play in that in terms of generating a more gender equal society, we do see these kind of push and pull there's a kind of an ambiguity over how it might affect, because on the one hand you're opening up access to paid work from within the home, but at the same time children don't just disappear, and domestic care responsibilities don't just disappear when that work's being done, and there's growing evidence now about how that's been affecting men and women differentially over COVID. Now, one of the things with COVID and trying to understand what some of about the productivity and career consequences of, if you like, this interaction of paid and unpaid work within the home, with COVID, we don't have good enough data. We don't actually know what the impact of a lot of this has been yet. There's a lot of speculation, but very little evidence. And, if you look back, however, we can so in this paper, what I'm trying to say is I think we can learn quite a lot about the difficulties that working parents may have faced during COVID from understanding actually gender differences in work in online labour markets before this. And of course, for this audience, I guess all of you guys, you're interested in online labour markets anyway in their own right, because it's a growing part of the labour market. We see that, in the online labour index, the number of tasks posted in the 5 largest platforms grew by more than 40% in the years leading up to the pandemic. We've got 48 million workers worldwide who are registered with online labour platforms. So, I think understanding kind of work dynamics on these platforms is interesting, both because it's interesting in its own right, and because I think it can provide some really valuable insights about what we might think about some of the inequality potentially in how working from home might play out, even in, if you like, non-platform type work settings. And so in order to do this, in this paper, I analyze gender differences in working patterns and in wages in a popular online labour market called Amazon Mechanical Turk. And I'm doing this in data pre-2020. Now, the idea behind Amazon Mechanical Turk is that workers are each completing kind of these small micro tasks for a fixed piece rate that's fixed in advance. And the reason from a gender economics and like a gender in the labour market perspective that I think this setting is so interesting is at least fourfold. So the first is that on this online labour market, workers are anonymous and gender is not visible. Okay, so a direct discrimination story here is it becomes very difficult to try and construct. The second is that there's quite a lot of evidence that shows that so in careers where you get the returns, like sorry, the wage you get, you only get a really high wage if you're like working really, really long hours. Okay, so that's like a convex earnings in returns to hours worked. In that case, it becomes very difficult. You know, if you do have these domestic care constraints, it's really difficult to get into these top jobs because of the long hours, and so that can cause issues. Whereas in these online labour markets where work is being paid by task in a piece rate, you don't see that kind of structure of you only really get the big bucks if you work long hours. Okay, so it's a linear payment schedule. There's also very little role for direct negotiation and competition, which again, we've seen gender differences in preference over. And finally, one thing, this Uber paper about the Uber pay gap, you know, there might be quite good reasons why women don't want to work late at night in kind of different areas. So even though if you like, their payments are being determined by an app, there might still be like this possibility of direct interaction and harassment with consumers because the work is being done in an offline setting. And so the setting I'm going to be looking at is going to be a fully online labour market. Workers and employers are going to be matched online and the work is going to be done online. And so just to give you a preview of my results, I was telling Astrid beforehand, I can talk about this for hours. So it's a good idea if I give you the kind of highlights first, if I have to rush a little bit. But for my primary analysis, I'm going to be making use of very rich data on about 2,700 workers who are using a particular app whilst they're working on Mturk. And I'm going to be able to observe all the characteristics of the tasks they're doing. And crucially, I'm going to observe exactly when they're scheduling work. In addition to this, I also posted a survey on Amazon Mechanical Turk, which I can actually link their answers back, these workers' answers back, to their work histories. So we can actually say, for different demographic groups, for example, men and women without children, what do their work patterns look like, which is going to allow me to go beyond the starting point that I had with the discussions with the International Labour Organization. So the kind of positive, I think, story and the first angle is that so if you look at the labour market, the offline labour market, there is massive occupational segregation of men and women. So men and women are choosing to do very, very different types of work on average. And in this online labour market setting, I don't find any significant gender differences in the types of tasks that men and women are choosing to do. So men and women are choosing, they're equally likely to choose survey tasks, to choose research tasks, they're equally likely to choose high value and low value tasks. Also, men and women are accumulating experience at the same rate on the site. So they're both likely, there's no gender differences in how many tasks men and women are doing, which again, you do see in offline labour markets, on average, women kind of accumulate experience more slowly because they're more likely to work part-time or take career breaks. The other thing, this final bullet point is kind of in quite economic speak, but the other thing that I don't find any significant gender differences is, if you like, kind of productivity. So men and women, if we're looking at the same task, and we're saying that men and women have the same working pattern, then there's no difference in the amount of time that it's going to be taking men and women to complete the same type of task. Nonetheless, given all of this, I find a 20% difference, so the same as the ILO survey, in wages. Okay, and you're like, wait a second, but you've just told me that there's no difference in the piece rate that they're at, and like in the value of the task they're choosing. So what's happening here is that women are less likely to work, sorry, this is the easy way to put it. Women have more fragmented work patterns on the site on average. They're more likely to take breaks between adjacent tasks and take longer breaks between completing one task and starting another. And what that does is it means that on average, women are completing similar tasks at like more slowly because of this fragmentation in their working pattern. And this really links to like quite a big literature on, if you like, kind of workflow and like the product and like the impacts of multitasking on your productivity. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is men and women are doing the same types of tasks. However, women are less, they're being interrupted more. They've got this more fragmented work schedule. And so they're completing each task slightly, like kind of more slowly, meaning it's taking them longer to accumulate the same amount of earnings than men. And the other kind of neat thing is actually I'll go into, is that I can show that this fragmentation of the working pattern is really concentrated amongst workers with children. Okay, so you know, again, not necessarily news now, but there's very little data which actually says, apart from really this, which says, look, online labor market or like working from home, men and women are doing the same type of stuff, but women with kids are facing these interruptions which fragment the working pattern and cause them to complete work more slowly. So just to give a bit more information on Mturk, because I'm not entirely sure, there's often like kind of a bit of a, there are some people who've heard of it, other people who haven't. So just to tell you a little bit more information about the platform itself. So Mturk was started by Amazon, I think it was in like the mid 2000s actually, basically because Amazon needed a system to categorize all of the millions and zillions of products that it had on its site. And what it realized was that it was much cheaper for them to get their workers to actually tag all of these products in their kind of, you know, time between other things they should be doing, rather than train some fancy AI algorithm to kind of automatically tag them, because humans are still much quicker at recognizing certain things than kind of pattern recognition in machines. So Amazon then thought, you know, Jeff Bezos is like, well, if I'm finding this useful, there's probably millions of other employers who also need the same thing. Let's make this into a kind of an external platform rather than just having it internal. And the way that it works is as follows. So this is the dashboard of Mturk. So you as a requester, so requesters are employers basically. They upload tasks to the site, which then me as a worker, I can come and choose and like self-select into these different types of tasks. Now there are two things that I want you to kind of think about here. So one is that it's often the case that for an employer, so let's think about the easiest, James Billings in the top, okay? So he's posted this market research survey on Mturk, and he's posted 9,420 of those. So those are, you know, so for each task, there might be multiple instances of it. But for doing any one of those tasks, the reward you get, the piece rate, is typically very low. So here you only get paid 1 cent for doing James's market research task. Okay. Now, when this gets interesting later is if you think about David Yangizawa Drott's task here, which is collect data from a website. Okay, and here he's got a large number of these individual tasks, each of which isn't paid very much. What I'd like you to think in mind is that for some of these tasks like David's, workers are going to be able to go back and complete the same task over and over again. Okay, so if it's like get this bit from this website and then get a bit from another, you know, you can potentially build up, if you like, quite quick experience with some of these types of tasks. So or like find website and collect information, for example. But for some of often as well, another common task is like clean a particular line of a spreadsheet. You might have 1,000 different tasks for each line of the spreadsheet. Okay, so the more that you're going to do of those tasks, potentially the faster you're going to get. So the data I'm using is worker log data collected by an app that workers are using on the site over 2016, 2017. And I basically observe everything that you saw on that screen. So I observe the name of the task, who the requester was, are there any keywords? You can also normally click down and there are more keywords that there's a longer description of the task that you can look at. Crucially, what I also observe is when workers start a hit and when they submit it. So that allows me to kind of come up with a measure of working time. So what I'm able to do is, if you like, construct a panel of wages by just taking how much is someone getting paid for a task and how long did it take them to actually do it. Okay, so then the effective hourly earnings is just how much did you get divided by how long did it take you to do it. I'm going to go on. So the first thing, I'm going to skip over a bunch of the kind of technicalities here, but what we're going to be wanting to do is look at, okay, so is there a wage gap? Is there a difference in the amount, the effective, if you like, hourly earnings of men and women on the site? And then we're going to be trying to kind of control for different reasons, if you like, about why that might be there, in order to kind of see if I can explain that pay gap. Now, this is kind of, there's quite a lot of information on this slide. On the y-axis here, so this shows you the percentage difference in men and women's pay, effective wages, as we start controlling for different aspects of the task. So this red bar here, okay, what this shows you is that on average in the data set, women have a 20% lower wage than men. So that's why, so the red kind of bar thing gets to -0.2. These skinny lines give you the confidence and some stuff on confidence intervals. But this light blue line, okay, so here what I'm doing is I'm using a regression framework to control for what the value of the tasks was. Okay, so if men and women were choosing, so imagine that men would, like, all the tasks that men did were paid $1 per task, whereas all the tasks that women did were paid like 1 cent. Okay, then you would expect that because men and women are choosing different tasks of different values, if I control for the task reward, this bar should be the red, we should have a bar which is smaller than the red bar. But actually what we see is when we control for the value of the task, when we control for the task type, so is it a research task, is it a survey task, is it a transcription task, is it a whatever other type of task that you can think of, bar doesn't change. And then the final one here, this black bar, is also when I control for how much experience does a worker have on, how many tasks have they already done in the past. Okay, so the fact that this bar doesn't change, really, that changes height, tells you that on all of the standard dimensions that we usually think about in the offline labour market for being key reasons why men and women might have different wages, they're doing different jobs, they've got different experience, these things aren't operative here. And that's not so surprising when we actually look at, okay, so what are the choices that men and women are making on the sites when it comes to the value of tasks and what types of tasks they're doing. So here on the x-axis, this is the piece rate associated with any given task. And then the y-axis is the cumulative distribution function. Okay, so the key thing here is that the blue line, which is women, the red line, which represents men, there's not really any difference in them. So the key takeaway from this slide is that men and women are doing like they're picking tasks of the same value. This graph shows you as well, it shows you what types of the categories of tasks that men and women are picking on the site. So the reds are the females, and then the see-through bars are the men. And here what you can see is, again, that actually there's not too much difference in the proportion of transcription tasks versus research tasks that men and women are doing. There are some small differences, but when you do the formal tests, they're not statistically significantly different. Okay, so at this point, to be honest, I was a bit stumped when I was like looking at this, because, you know, if you look at like the past literature on why we get gender pay gaps, it's because, you know, as I say, women do different types of tasks, or they're accumulating less experience. It's not happening here. So what I ended up doing was really thinking a little bit more carefully about the fact that these tasks are being done at in the home, and potentially alongside domestic production. And there are two in the original ILO survey that I mentioned. Some of the final questions were like, can you tell me like what you most enjoy about working on this online labor platform? And these are cherry picked, but these are, I think, just like two really great quotes, which I think bring to life a little bit of what I'm going to be trying to show you with numbers in a minute. So when asked, why do you do this, or what do you most enjoy about working on Mturk? So one person said, you know, I'm able to help my disabled husband when needs be and still bring in money. Or someone saying, you know, Mturk allows me to stop a task if needs be, so that I can care for a baby if she needs, like, if she's coughing or like shaking or whatnot. So these are two. I could actually have picked out a lot more, because there were a lot of individuals who were kind of saying this flexibility to quickly move between paid work and some people even and my real job, which is how some people have described it in the survey, is something that seems to be very important. Now, this kind of, if you like, this lack of boundary potentially between care work and paid work within the home might cause, there are two different things that how this could be kind of manifesting itself in what I'm doing. So the first is that men and women could have different working patterns that I can observe. Okay, so I observe when people start hits and when they stop them. Okay, so I'm going to be able to observe, is it that, for example, men and women are taking longer breaks or more breaks in their working time, which might be indicative of them going off and having to attend to care responsibilities. Another thing that could be happening is that actually when I'm saying, I'm measuring all the time between someone starting a hit and stopping it as working time. And but if someone starts a hit and then goes off and helps their disabled husband and then comes back, I'm going to be thinking that they've just taken ages to do a particular type of task, when actually they're only working for a little bit, but the clock was still running. Now, I'm going to be focusing on the first of these, on the different working patterns, because there's not a huge amount I can say about the degree to which working time is systematically mismeasured. There are two checks that I've got that I won't be able to go into too much detail on, but just suffice it to say, the vast majority of these tasks are done in less than 2 minutes. So there's not a huge amount of wiggle room for people to like go off and care for someone and then come back. And there's other patterns in the data which suggest that, you know, yes, I probably am mismeasuring working time to some degree, but it doesn't seem to be the first order issue that's going on. So focusing on the first of these, I'm sorry, this is a really terrible picture, but you know, I'm a bit stumped about how to do it better. What I'd like you to think about here is like we're moving through time, okay? And imagine, and this is a very stereotypical, imagine your like average man and your average woman who are both completing 20 tasks. So what I'm going to be trying to capture in what I'm about to show you is the fact that if you don't have some of these kind of this interaction with your domestic care responsibilities, potentially, you might be able to schedule all of these 20 tasks in very quick succession, one after the other, okay, and get, you know, so like the red thingy here. Whereas if what you have is actually that you're working, but then, you know, you're having to attend to kids or whatever it is, actually you might get this fragmentation of the working pattern, okay? So we're going to have longer breaks between adjacent tasks, and potentially these 20 tasks kind of batched into kind of a large number of work sessions. And indeed, this is what we see. So the fact here, so this is basically showing you the fact that these, the density, so that I'm just going to describe what this graph shows. So what this shows you here, the fact that this blue bar at the end is like high, okay, that is showing you that the men in my data set are more likely to do many, many tasks in a single work session. What this graph shows you is that men are also, the fact that the blue thing here is much higher, right at the bottom of the X, right at the low part of the X-axis, this shows you that men are much more likely to take very, very short breaks between adjacent tasks. So it does seem that on average, this terrible picture here is what we're seeing kind of coming out in the data, that men are doing many, many more tasks in one sitting with much shorter breaks between them on average. So right, yes, I'm actually, so we've got different, now one of the kind of challenges if you're wanting to study some of this is that you know, the breaks between tasks, and so a lot of these things interact, okay? So, you know, I might be working on tasks in very, very quick succession if they're all very, very similar types of tasks, for example. And so that kind of, anyway, so that kind of can create a bit of an issue in trying to say, okay, well, of this 20% gender wage gap, I want to say that X% of it is because of breaks, and Y% of it is because of experience or whatnot, because all of these things are kind of correlated and interact. What this graph here shows you is the results of a decomposition called a Gelbach decomposition, which tries to, if you like, chop up the or tries to explain the wage gap that's observed into different things, into the different components which drive it. Okay. Now, the key thing here, if we look at some of the things we looked at before, so task type and experience and task reward, the fact that these circles are very close to 0 tells you that, as we saw before, they aren't doing anything to explain the gender pay gap here. However, what we see is that if you look at these work session, like I've got various work pattern controls, which I won't talk about in any detail, but suffice it to say, what I've tried to do is construct controls to kind of, if you like, get at some of these work pattern things that we were talking about. We can see that these are statistically significant drivers of this wage gap, and they're the only ones that are statistically significant drivers of this wage gap. Okay, so both of these you know, are important components. I'm going to skip that. Another thing which I think is a kind of a good indirect check on this is, okay, so there are different types of tasks. So in the qualitative literature, for example, so some colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute, for example, have done, I think, some, like, you know, in-depth, as other people have, but it's just their work I've read the most, some kind of in-depth surveys with platform workers about how they think about like their productivity and what's good for their working patterns and whatnot. And one of the things which comes out is that, well, there are some types of tasks which you do need to do, like you know, you need to do lots of them in quick succession to really kind of get fast at them and, you know, become more productive. So where there are others, like research tasks or survey tasks, which you're only ever allowed to do them once, because there are usually kind of checks which say, for a survey, you can only take the survey once because a researcher doesn't want 1,600 of exactly the same person's responses. Okay. So if we think about this mechanism here, that interruptions are undermining, these interruptions are harming women's ability to quickly complete tasks, those are probably going to be more important for some of these batch tasks, okay, where you get where you're mainly doing many tasks over and over again of a very similar type, so you can kind of get these learning by doing and workflow effects. But they're probably not going to be very important for like research and survey tasks, which you're only going to do them once. It doesn't really matter so much about this kind of workflow business. So what I did was I kind of went and categorized the tasks that I have in a kind of a crude way, but it was the best I could do, into batch tasks or unit tasks, i.e. tasks which you tend to do many of, or ones which you only do, they're kind of one-off. And so what you can see is that most of the one-off tasks are these research and survey tasks. And something I think which is, have I got it? Oh no, okay. So one of the things which I'm going to just talk you through this slide, and what you find is that there is absolutely no gender wage gap in the unit tasks. Okay, in the tasks where you would expect that there isn't very big returns to like workflow, you don't see any gender differences in wages. And it's only for these ones where you kind of would think that actually these interruptions would be having a really big effect, that you see that actually the wage gap is all there. So in the paper, I kind of, it's quite nice because I can kind of look at all of this more formally. So what these graphs show is that, so you should think about the y-axis here is like kind of as productivity, basically, is like the amount of time you're taking to complete a task. And what you can see is that for these unit tasks, basically you're equally productive, no matter these work session type controls, like there's not much going on. Whereas for the batch tasks, you do get more productive the many more tasks that you do. And so again, this is why, a nice indirect check that it really is work pattern control. It is really these interruptions and work pattern things rather than something else in the background going on. Now, just for the last 2 minutes, I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about the survey that I ran, because I think there's some kind of interesting stuff in it. So what I did here was I posted a task on Mturk for $2.50, and which is a pretty, if you remember back to what the piece rates were, this was a juicy task. Okay, so what I was trying to do was like make it so attractive that even the highest earners in the data set would want to take the task. And what I'm able to do is, because people were able to I asked them to give me their worker ID. I'm able to like match up their survey answers with the data that I've got on how they're behaving using their worker ID. And one of the questions I asked was about, did you have children in the household, of course. And so here, what you can see is that the red bars give the differences in the breaks and average length of work sessions for people without kids. And the fact that the skinny line goes over 0, okay, what that says is that there's no difference between childless men and childless women in their work patterns. However, for men and women with kids, for parents, there are big differences in their work patterns. What we see is that women with kids take longer breaks between tasks and complete fewer tasks in a work session. Okay, so this is all being driven by parents. What we also see is that I asked like a bunch of Likert type questions about what was important to you, about why you were doing this type of work. And men are much more likely to say that care responsibilities are not at all important for explaining why they're crowd working. And they're much more likely to say that only working from home is also not a good explainer for why they're crowd working. Again, in the paper, in the appendix, So my website, I've got like, anyway, we asked tons of stuff, but in like a 40-minute talk, you know, you can't go into too much detail. But we asked, yeah, like a lot of things on motivations for why you were working in this way, and like satisfaction with that way of working. And another quite interesting dimension that we've kind of found is around disability, like the interaction of disability with online work, which I'm happy to take some questions on. This is a techie slide, but what it shows is that, as you might have hypothesized, there is the gender wage gap is, and in the importance of work pattern controls. It's all being driven by basically differences in the behavior of mothers and fathers. There are no differences that we can find between like the wages and working patterns of childless men and women. It's really, you know, it does seem to be a kind of a care story, which is really at the heart here. So just to conclude, in this paper, so in terms of how it kind of relates to your broader agenda at the center in terms of digital futures at work, what we're showing is that even though work might look, you know, it's, you know, on a digital online labor platform, or, you know, with Uber, it's being priced using an algorithm. Like, of course, why would we see gender inequality like kind of emerge in this kind of gender blind setting? What I'm trying to say is that there are lots of ways in which it doesn't. There aren't systematic differences in the types of tasks that men and women are doing, but nonetheless, you can't ignore the fact that there are these kind of structural inequalities in the organization of work and childcare within the home. It still feeds in to, of course, how we're thinking about the ability and interaction with work within the home with these online platforms. The other thing I think it's quite interesting to think about is that, you know, interruptions and fragmentation of work schedules, at least in this setting, does seem to have real effects for productivity. Understanding a little bit more about why that's the case, and the degree to which, for example, you know, different types, you know, are you getting notifications on your mobile phone, or the fact that, you know, us being on our laptops the whole time, that's kind of an interdependent workplace. Of course, it's not kids who are bugging us, but I've had like a gazillion Teams notifications while talking to you just now. You know, there's, I think, you know, it kind of does open up a lot of other questions. But yeah, I'll leave it there and looking forward to discussing further. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Abby, for this brilliant presentation on this very fascinating research project. So I'm going to moderate the discussion. So I would like to encourage all of you to turn on your cameras, if you can, if you like. And if you have a question, you can either raise the hand button, or you can put a question into the chat. And actually, I have a couple of questions, but I want to be very brief, so maybe I start. So could you say a bit more about how wages are formed? So we've seen these fixed piece rates. So I suppose it's not through bargaining. The next question is, do you have some geographical information? So because I was thinking about running separate wage regressions and see if there's some socio-cultural differences across countries, also in terms of the role of mother and father and taking care responsibilities. And the last one is, so I wonder, should we really call it a gender wage gap? Isn't it more like a kid gap? Because if you think, for example, of Germany, we have a gender wage gap of about 20% on average. So, so let's say you have a woman who's earning 80 euro cents per hour of work, and a man would earn €1. And here we have this fixed piece rate. So it's not a difference between the woman and the man, but we see it's obviously, this is really nice what you found out in your research, that there's a childcare problem. And then this would also mean different policy conclusions, right? So it's not so much about the employer-employee relationship and about labor market policies, but it's about family policies. And please, politics, take care of better family care and care facilities.
Oh, super good point. So the first on the wages, you're completely right. So it's so I could have written this paper not about in terms of using a language of a wage gap, but instead in terms of a working time gap. But that just seemed like a little bit kind of complicated when I was trying to write it that way, because the way of thinking about it is like, so a man and woman who are, they might both be doing a task which is worth $1, but the woman will take 20% longer, given this fragmentation, given the kind of cost of these interruptions to complete that task. It just seemed easier in terms of understanding like the magnitude and getting the language right. I turned it into a wage gap, but you're totally right that it's kind of, there is a little bit of a kind of uncomfortableness in that language there. I would love to have run different regressions for different countries. Unfortunately, I only observed countries for the like 700 or 800 people who take the survey, so it's like a little bit too noisy to look at that. But I think you're completely right, and maybe even if we so in the future with more data, I agree that would be super interesting to look at. On the final thing, in terms of what does this mean in terms of policy, and does this kind of recenter a policy debate away from employers and into kind of more of the public policy space, I both agree and kind of disagree. So I think on the agreement side, most of my policy kind of experience is in the UK. And our childcare system and the way that even we conceive of childcare as actually a piece of vital public infrastructure, it's just kind of, it's not thought of as part of the economy. And you saw this very strongly during COVID when, when giving evidence to the Equality Select Committee, Kemi Badenoch was asked about why was there no targeted financial package to kind of improve the financial security of childcare providers in the UK? Because there's a lot of issues with how that sector is financed. She was like, well, and this is, by the way, this is a quote, it's in the report, but she basically says like, oh, well, nightclubs, like there've been lots of sectors that have been really hard hit by COVID. Like, think about nightclubs. And you're like, wait, we're talking about childcare here. This is like, we should think about this like roads or like the electricity kind of system, not like nightclubs. I'm not saying I don't like nightclubs, but you know what I mean. So I think there is not seeing actually childcare as a piece of economic public infrastructure, which is a big issue. So completely agree on that. However, one of the things I think it would be interesting to do a bit more work on is how do we think about task design or job design in ways that might minimize the impact of these interruptions, or if we take it as a kind of fact of life at the moment that when working from home, mothers are going to face potentially more interruptions than men. How do we then think about I don't know how we remunerate work and how we think about success and how we judge quality in that case? Because what I find here is that in this paper is that there's no difference in the quality of work that men and women do. So it's just that it's taking mothers a bit longer to do it, and that might be totally fine is for many types of tasks, and so you might not want to penalize mothers unnecessarily for that if the work they're doing is actually it's still absolutely of like the best quality. And as I said, we might also want to think about how is it that we tweak other aspects of the environments or the tasks to make it more amenable to, if you like, this juggling.
All right, thanks. So we have questions in the chat by Chirantan Chatterjee. I hope I pronounced it almost correctly. So would you like to unmute yourself and pose the question on your own? And maybe just briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, and you got my name correct. So, very fascinating paper. I just had some descriptive clarifications about the data. One was on, I'm presuming it's a longitudinal data, so you have some information on what's the share of women among the entire workforce on Upwork? How is it changing? Is there a particular point in time where there was a sudden spike in women's share of the total workforce? Second was, I was pondering about that statement by the lady in your slides on the anecdote that with Mturk, I can help my disabled husband. So on the margin for this woman, um, this is actually welfare enhancing, because in a world without Mturk, potentially she could not even have done the little that she's able to do with Mturk.
Yeah.
So then the question is, can we have some intuition of how these women are? I mean, are these results more stronger for those who are first time Upwork folks, or ones who are doing some repeat jobs, and maybe there's some learning about how to deal with fragmentation in the process, which can somewhat mitigate whatever other wage distortions are showing? And the last one, I think, is around policy or product design. So was there something that Mturk did inadvertently in the product design that reduced the burden of fragmentation, which you can leverage for more causal arguments, was something that I was thinking. And I'm an economist here at the SPRU, working on matters related to innovation.
Perfect. All such brilliant points. First, very quickly about the share of women in the population over time. So Mturk is kind of unlike, if you like, other gig economy, some like gig economy platforms like Uber, which is like, for example, majority men. Mturk is 50-50, is about 50-50 male, female. As far as I know, that stayed over time and is similar in the data in terms of who's selecting into the app that I'm using. So in terms of the welfare enhancing bit, I think that's actually a really important point. One of the things that I don't have here is the fact that we asked in the survey, like, do you still want to continue working on Mturk in like in a year, or I can't remember things. And women were much more likely to say that they were. Women with kids, were much more likely to say that they did see themselves continuing to work on the platform and would recommend it to a friend than others. So in a kind of, if you like, revealed preference or stated preference type sense, you're right. And I guess what I'm trying to say in this paper is, like, it's not necessarily therefore that this work is bad necessarily. It's just that it's clear that just thinking that it's an online platform, it's kind of setting, that doesn't mean that men and women are necessarily competing on, or participating in the same way, on the same footing, given this kind of difference in the interaction of other constraints. But so when we think as well about like reducing, there's how is it that we reduce the cost to marginal participation in the labour market, and allowing people to do a small number of hours that might really benefit certain types of workers. One thing I can't say, this isn't, I guess, as it doesn't seem as salient in the Mturk setting, but from what I've just said, about part-time work, you might still be worried about spillover effects of that into other parts of, in like on other parts of the labour market. I would have loved it if there was a natural experiment. I had like referees being like, oh, well, can you like locate this just to when like school closed, like, is there differences in school closing? I've only got this data for 2016, 2017. So I sadly am not able to exploit things to the degree I would like. But I think it does say that, if other people want to collect similar data, I think it would be good. But no, really, really great questions. I can just see another question in the chat about ethical issues with the survey and matching their activity on the platform. I was working, so the people who designed this app, so Christy Milland, who she used to basically run Turka Nation, which is one of the main message boards for Mturk workers. So there was no deception or anything in terms of how their information was going to be used. There's no names collected, if you like, or no identifying information that was collected. So, and it was clear in the survey that like who was collecting it and how it was going to be used. Yeah.
Great. Actually, we were running short of time, so there's some more question by Simon Deacon. Simon, would you like to pose a question very quickly?
Hello, Abby. I was a bit late joining this talk because I was just teaching a labour law supervision about the Uber case and what's an employer. And your paper does refer to these, I guess I'd call them clients or buyers of the service as employers, but I wonder if they are, and what difference at all that would make to the economic analysis in your study. I know it's not a legal paper, but I'm just wondering if this affects either how we interpret the results or what we might do with them.
I think that's a really, because there are 2 points. So yeah, I shouldn't call them employers. That was more, sorry, economists are bad with language, especially legal language. But yeah, I would agree that, I mean, the term in Mturk is a requester, but client. In terms of what would it mean? So I can't remember the name of the platform now, but there used to be a platform, or maybe it's still operative, where in a sense, what you really wanted to do was to get, if you like, put on the books of one of the requesters, so they can just repeatedly push you work. So if you have like a particular star, you've been identified as a good worker in terms of your star rating or how you've behaved in the past, such that then as a requester, what you might want to do is then only push particular tasks to that pool, which then, as you say, kind of then does start to create something which looks more like maybe a 0 hours relationship, depending on, I guess, how you're like thinking about what the outside options are. Where I think it could get interesting is this point on task design and job design. So because part of these issues are the fact that with some of these jobs, what you're doing is taking one big job and splitting it up into thousands of little ones, which kind of in some senses might amplify how we think about the costs or consequences of these introductions. Because if I have to jump ship and go and start looking after my kid, another worker can come in and kind of grab all of these other tasks, which I then don't have the opportunity to start to learn and kind of get the learning by doing benefits from. So I do think it could have some more kind of interesting implications there about how we think about a gender equal design of the kind of fragmentation of the job itself.
Yeah, thank you. There's 2 more questions, and I think we're going to take them. So there's, on the one hand, Ben Hopkinson. So would you like to pose the question yourself?
Yeah, sure. This is just coming out from an EDI perspective, as someone trying to design work to be as inclusive as possible. And a huge chunk of our workforce are at home. Was there an inflection point in task length where you started to notice this gap make a big difference? And is it so short that it's not particularly viable for sort of more conventional workplaces?
That's such a good question. I don't have a very good answer to it. And I think that one of the weird things with the Mturk setting is the fact that these really are micro tasks. So a lot of them, as I said, you're taking actually sometimes what is one big job, scrape this information off a website or clean this spreadsheet, and kind of making it into lots of small bits. So it's kind of difficult for me to say at what point do some of these things then start to be operative in terms of how we think about the design of more standard kind of work tasks, which are now kind of in this slightly intermediate stage, I guess, in some jobs with working from home and having to kind of, maybe think about a non-co-located workforce. But that's given me lots of thoughts, that question, and I will reach out if I think of anything better I can do with the data. So I don't have an answer for you right now, but it's a great question.
Oh, thanks for a great talk.
Yeah, thank you. Jackie, would you like to pose the last question?
Thank you. It's a fascinating talk. And raised, following on from Simon's point, would it be possible to do an analysis of the types of requester in the way, say, Deborah Howcroft and others have done types of platform workers? I mean, it might be quite interesting just to see, okay, you've got Amazon on one hand who initiated it as a big multinational, and then you've got, it would just be interesting to see what types of people were requesters, and were they really actually employers, or were they other types? I don't know, I have no idea what they'd be like.
I think that's a really brilliant point. So another thing which is quite interesting about the Mturk platform is that there's only one-sided ratings. So built into the platform, only requesters, sorry, can rate work, can rate the workers, but there's not on the platform a way in which the workers can actually rate who the requesters are, there's people who are interested in this, Six Silberman and Linnea, who's actually, where is he now? He was at EE Metal, and Lily Irani, who's a sociologist at UC Davis or UC Irvine. Anyway, they created, when they were doing their PhD, something called Turk, which was a kind of a plugin that workers could use to create ratings for the requesters in terms of like wage theft and whatnot. Now that's kind of undergone various iterations, but anyway, I think it's quite, there's some really interesting stuff written about it, and I think it's a cool project. In a sense, the requesters are slightly easier to get information on one level, because their identity-ish is kind of known, because you can scrape that information directly off the website. There's a guy at NYU Stern whose name is not coming to me right now. It'll be in the appendix actually to my paper. So there are some people who have been actively scraping information on the requesters off Mturk. Often the angle is how concentrated the labour market is. So you actually often see that it's only a small number of these requesters who are responsible for a large number of the of the jobs that are actually posted on Mturk. So you might think about that as giving them quite a lot of power in terms of setting the piece rates, and like they have like potentially undue, I'll say, influence over how the market like dynamics go. Yeah, so Mturk Tracker is where I'd look for that. The person who set that up has got quite a lot of stuff on the requesters.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks a lot to Abi. It's been a pleasure to have you here in our seminar. Great presentation. Thanks to all of the attendees. We will be back on the 3rd of November with a talk on diversity and digital exclusion, developing an inclusive agenda for digital futures at work. And the talk is given by Nimi Patel, who is Policy Manager for Skills, Talent and Diversity at Tech UK. So thank you very much, and hope to see you next time.